Linda Hall didn't know her parents well. The girl was 5 years old when her mother and father died in a terrible car accident, which happened because their tire burst while they were driving. Linda will forever remember the tear-stained face of her grandmother standing at the graves of her daughter and son-in-law. Fortunately, Barbara Hall had the strength and health to raise her granddaughter and even help her get a good education. Realizing that her grandmother was having a hard time, Linda tried not to give her any trouble and help her around the house whenever possible. After graduating from high school, Linda got accepted into a university and chose to study economics. Studying wasn't hard for the young woman, and she soon became one of the best students in her year. Moreover, Linda was very pretty, which gave her grandmother anxiety. "Just don't rush to start a family, dear. Finish college first and get a good job, and only then start thinking about men," said Barbara Hall. "Of course, Grandma. And when would I even think about them, when studying takes up so much of my energy and time?" the young woman answered embarrassedly. But as it turned out a little later, Linda wasn't entirely honest with her grandma, as she already had a boyfriend. George was handsome and the captain of the university football team, and he immediately won the heart of the pretty and timid young woman. Meanwhile, no one had any doubts about the sincerity of the young man's feelings, since he always expressed his emotions very loudly and openly. The young people spent all their free time together, and everyone around them had long gotten used to seeing them as a couple. One day, Linda finally mustered up her courage and invited George to her place for dinner. She decided to introduce him to her grandmother. Despite the fact that George came over with a bouquet of roses and a cake, Barbara Hall still didn't like him. Of course, she didn't say anything out loud, and being a good hostess, did everything so that George wouldn't feel uncomfortable. And only when her granddaughter's boyfriend went home did the elderly woman say, "Oh dear, you won't be happy with him. Take my word for it, these handsome men are often windy. They enjoy getting women to fall in love with them." But Linda ignored her grandmother's words because she always listened to her heart. And this time, it wasn't wrong. Immediately after the graduation, George proposed to Linda, which surprised her grandmother very much. Of course, Barbara Hall didn't think that the young man would turn out to be so decent and honest in his relationship with her granddaughter. Like many elderly people, Barbara mistakenly believed that the younger generation was nothing like the previous one, and that there were no real romantics left. But George's behavior proved that he was worthy of being the husband of her granddaughter. As it turned out a little later, the young couple rushed to get married because Linda was already in her second month of pregnancy, and George, being a decent guy, felt obliged to marry her. The news of the impending wedding and her granddaughter's pregnancy made Mrs. Hall incredibly happy. She was delighted at the mere thought that she would soon become a great-grandmother. Linda and George held a modest wedding ceremony and rented a house on the outskirts of the city. The newlyweds didn't want to put out Barbara Hall, who had several chronic illnesses due to her advanced age. The birth of little Lisa became the most important event in the life of the young couple. Looking at her great-granddaughter, Mrs. Hall couldn't hold back her tears of joy. "God, she looks so much like your mother. The same blue eyes and that upturned nose," the woman whispered, picking up the baby. But Linda and George didn't stop at the birth of one child. The newlyweds loved children so much that they had two more beautiful girls, Susan and Carol. Their young family was strong and happy. By this time, George had been working as a truck driver for 3 years. He got a job with a trucking company that transported goods across the country. Since their family had grown and needed more money, the man spent most of his time behind the wheel. He liked driving around their big country, listening to the noise of the engine and the rustle of tires on the pavement. Linda, on the other hand, devoted herself entirely to raising their 3 daughters, whom she loved more than life itself. "You've become a great mother, my dear. Now I can die in peace," Barbara Hall once said. "No, Grandma, what are you even talking about? You still have a lot of life to live. Why would you even say that?" exclaimed Linda. But the elderly woman knew perfectly well that the body couldn't be deceived, and thus, sooner or later, her illness would prevail. But when Linda got pregnant again, a spark of hope shone in the eyes of the old woman. "Well, now I definitely cannot die, especially after the ultrasound showed that you're having twins. That's a real miracle," the old woman said with pride in her voice. This time, Linda and George were having boys, whom their sisters immediately surrounded with love and care. Raising 5 children could hardly be called an easy task, so Linda had her hands full. The twins, Kevin and Ethan, were nothing like their sisters and always got in trouble. Linda and George couldn't be happier. Their life was great. Their future was planned out for years to come, and they felt that nothing could go wrong. Unfortunately, that's when trouble knocked on Linda Hall's door. With the will of evil fate, George got into a car accident 2 days before his 30th birthday. The accident wasn't George's fault. He was trying to avoid a collision with the car that drove into the oncoming lane. So he turned the wheel sharply to the right, causing his multi-ton truck to fall into a ravine. Unfortunately, the paramedics that arrived at the scene couldn't do anything but call the death of the truck driver. For the devastated Linda, the news of her husband's death turned out to be a strong blow that unsettled her for a long time. Unfortunately, that wasn't the only tragedy that befell the poor mother of many children. Barbara Hall, whose health quickly deteriorated after the news of George's death, outlived him by only half of a year. The unfortunate old woman died of a heart attack, which didn't spare her suffering heart. "God, why is this all happening to me?" Linda kept repeating, crying softly. The woman hadn't had time to recover from the first funeral yet, and now she had to go through another one. Unfortunately, poor Linda had lost 2 of her closest people in such a short time. And it was only her children who prevented her from plunging headlong into a deep depression. Lisa, Susan, and Carol took over some of the household chores, and little Kevin and Ethan, as if sensing that their mother needed support, stopped crying and acting up. But as we all know, trouble doesn't come alone, and future events served as a clear confirmation of this theory. The fact was that during Kevin's routine medical examination, the doctor noticed signs of an oncological disease, which could pose a threat to the little boy's life. "Excuse me, sir, can it be cured?" Linda asked in a trembling voice. "Mrs. Hall, I'll be frank. The chances of recovery are very high, but in order to minimize the risks, Kevin's going to need surgery. I also have to warn you that it will be very expensive," the pediatric oncologist answered. After the doctor's encouraging words, Linda even managed to pull herself together. But when she heard the amount announced by the medical specialist, her eyes immediately filled with tears. "But I can't raise that kind of money," Linda whispered, covering her face with her hands. The woman walked slowly down the street and thought frantically about where she could get the money. Of course, Linda could have tried to sell her grandmother's house. But on the other hand, she was well aware that the money received from the sale of the old woman's house was unlikely to be enough to pay even a quarter of the total amount. Deciding to postpone the sale, Linda began to call all her friends and acquaintances in order to borrow some money from them. Of course, there weren't many people willing to lend her more than a couple $100, and therefore this idea was clearly doomed to fail. And when Linda was about to lose all hope, she got some news from a provincial town in the north of Iowa. Apparently, her second cousin Lois had left her some inheritance. As it turned out, the single woman simply didn't have any other relatives, so she put Linda in her will. Linda didn't hesitate much. She took her children, bought the tickets, and took the first bus to Iowa. The passengers looked with surprise at the young mother, who was surrounded by so many small children. The house that Linda inherited from Lois Barnes turned out to be an old building from the beginning of the last century. Massive columns, ivory-covered walls, and red tiles gave it a majestic appearance. "Mom, are we going to live here now?" Lisa asked without hiding her surprise. "I think so, dear," Linda answered uncertainly. Surprisingly, the interior of the house turned out to be very nice and cozy. Sure, the furniture and interior design were old and didn't live up to the modern standards. While Linda looked around the house, moving from room to room, her children started a fun game of hide and seek and race. And only the sick Kevin didn't take part in the fun and quietly sat on a chair in the corner of the room. Suddenly, the boy's attention was attracted by a strange glint, which was reflected in the rays of the sun that penetrated through the curtains. Kevin got up from his chair and walked closer. The boy quickly realized that the strange glow was coming from an object that was barely visible through the cracks in the floorboards. Carefully touching the floorboards with his hands, the boy felt a barely noticeable recess, which apparently served as part of some secret construction. Kevin tugged at the plate with his fingers, and a niche immediately appeared before his eyes. It was filled with strange, shiny objects. "Mom, look what I found," the boy exclaimed in surprise. Linda didn't pay much attention to her son's words, but as she got closer, a look of amazement froze on her face. The fact was that there was a skillfully disguised niche in the floor, and there was real gold inside. There weren't only gold jewelry and precious stones, but also old banknotes from the Great Depression. God, it must all be worth a fortune. "Now I can finally pay for Kevin's treatment," Linda whispered with tears in her eyes. The children scurrying around her didn't even realize that a few minutes ago, their brother discovered a real treasure. Soon, all the local newspapers published news about Linda Hall, and the interview she gave quickly spread all over the news channels of the country. As it turned out a little later, this house once belonged to a wealthy landowner who lived there during the Great Depression. The gold that Kevin found on the floor most likely had something to do with him. After his death, the house had many owners, but none of them knew what secrets its walls were keeping. After selling some of the jewelry found in the niche, Linda sent Kevin to one of the best clinics in the country, where the boy had his surgery. Fortunately, the surgery went well, and Kevin recovered quickly. Linda Hall used the rest of the money to renovate the house, which changed her life for the better. Now, after the renovations, the house had regained its former grandeur and looked like new. But the most important thing was that for the first time in several decades, cheerful children's laughter sounded in this house, which made their mother feel very happy and calm.